The industry is overcapitalized. There are too many boats in that fishery really to support it. And the legislature and the Parks and Wildlife Commission have been very active in recognizing that oysters are such an important resource. And they've made some changes to regulations to try to get a handle on this. And one of those is this overcapitalization of the fleet. In 2005, the legislature passed Senate Bill 272. It basically created a license management program or a limited entry program for the oyster fishery. Limited entry programs have been used in other states and certainly in Texas very effectively to help control growing effort in a fishery that is not supported by the available resource. Shrimping is a good example in Texas. The shrimp fishery has been under a license management program since the early 90s. So in 2005, the legislature created a license management program for oysters. And the problem we ran into with that is that the industry they were very hesitant about this particular type of program. They didn't want to lose their access to the fishery. They felt like they were going to be cut out of the fishery. And so there were some changes in language made in the final elements of the bill. And for instance, there was no control date set on when the bill would become effective. And so we have been talking to the industry about a license management program for almost a year. And so they had an inkling, that this was coming. And typically in these fisheries, you set a control date so that you don't get speculators that buy into the fishery ahead of the time that the cap is established. And, but in this particular case, there was no control date set. So the governor signed the bill in June and said that as long as you have a license, commercial oyster fishing license, by August 31st of that same year, then you were in the fishery, basically. And so we had been monitoring and looking at the number of licenses being sold every year in this fishery for some time, and it averaged around 300 to 350 licenses. Now, that license can be put on any particular type of commercial oyster boat. Some of them were just converted shrimp boats. Some of them are the big luggers that are very specific for oyster fishing. But there was also no vessel limitations on that bill. In the shrimping industry, there were some constraints so that the fleet wouldn't grow, or fishing power, as we oftentimes refer to it, wouldn't go up. Fishing power certainly can apply to the size of the engine. A bigger engine gives you more lugging power, more power to pull that dredge. But fishing power can also be a bigger boat. If I'm in a fishery, and I've got a 30-foot boat and I get rid of that boat and I buy a 50-foot boat, my fishing power has gone up, because on days that were marginal that I couldn't go out on the water on a 30-foot boat, I can do it much more comfortably on a 50-foot boat. So that's the fishing power component. So there was no cap or no limitations on fishing power. And so what we're seeing is some of these boats now have gotten very big. We've got some luggers in Galveston that are pushing 80 feet in length now, huge boats. And so there was no constraint pushed on that. And as I said, we were seeing about 300 to 350 licenses per year that were being sold in that fishery. When the bill passed and was signed by the governor, at the end of August 2005, we had over 760 oyster boat licenses in the fishery. People went out and put a license on basically anything that floated. We had oyster boats that were 12-foot aluminum john boats that had an oyster boat license on it. I talked with some of our game wardens who sell licenses in their offices there in the Galveston area, and one of them was sharing with me that they kind of drew the line and said, nope, they weren't going to sell an oyster boat license to a guy who wanted to put it on a jet ski.